back to Genius Zone. We are on chapter 3. Let's get it. Freeing up mind space for genius to emerge. How to end your specific type of negative thinking. Here's another piece of wisdom it took me half a lifetime to learn. The biggest barrier blocking our path to genius is a habit of fear based negative thinking. Putting an end to the habit is a powerful investment in our genius. Paradoxically, our struggle with negative thinking ends only when we declare we have no control over it. That paradox changed my life, but at first it really flummoxed my mind. It had never occurred to me that the only way to stop my negative thoughts was to let go of trying to stop them. Some of the ways I'd been trying to control my negative thoughts by shaming myself for thinking them or trying to engage in positive thinking actually turned out to be the glue that held them in place. For example, when you find yourself in a stream of negative thoughts, you either continue to dwell on them or look for some way to get out of the stream. That's a key moment because what you decide to do determines whether you'll be happy or not. Many people make a costly mistake at that moment. They go into some form of combat with their negative thoughts. One type of combat is to criticize yourself for your negative thoughts, as I did, attempting to shame them into submission. Eventually, we discover it's futile and try to get rid of the negative thoughts by bombarding them with more negative thoughts. Like a dog chasing its own tail, you end up just going around in circles. Even though it goes back half a lifetime, I can still remember the jolt of awakening to how much I was trying to get rid of my negative thoughts by aiming negative thoughts at them. I realized I'd been playing host to a circular shooting match in my head, trying to kill off my thoughts of disappointment and misery by firing off a constant rat-a-tat of shame and blame at them. I also saw the futility of trying to counteract my negative thinking by paving over it with positive thoughts. No matter how many times I read The Power of Positive Thinking by Norman Vincent Peale, my negative thoughts would always come back to annoy and depress me. Then I discovered the paradoxical miracle I'm describing. The only way to change negative thinking begins with acknowledging that you have no control over it. By this application of the genius move, you are able to withdraw the energy you've been expending trying to control negative thinking. Then you can redirect that energy to those things you actually have the ability to change. I found this concept a slippery one to get a hold of at first. Let me give you an example of how it works in real life. I've worked with many clients who have benefited greatly from AA and other 12-step programs. One of them, a heroic fella I'll call Jay, not only found his own sobriety, but also went on to sponsor more than 600 recovering alcoholics over many decades. Jay told me about a life-changing moment, the first time he stood up and spoke at an AA meeting. He said, "My name's Jay, and I'm an alcoholic, and I have no idea how I'm going to stop drinking." He told me that it was a moment of clarity like nothing he had ever experienced before. "I suddenly felt lighter than the air," he said, like I'd been released from carrying a heavy burden in my head. For the past 2 years, he'd been shaming himself for his drinking, always apologizing and promising to do better. But on that magical day, he did something radically different. For 20 years, he'd been telling his concerned family and friends that he wasn't an alcoholic, that he could control his drinking. All the while, though, he had kept creating messes in his life that told a different story. Then came the moment when he stood up in public, owned his addiction, and declared it was out of his control. The radical act of transparency and acceptance brought a new sense of lightness to him. With the support of the group, he got through his first day in 20 years without a drink. Then he went back to a meeting the next day and was able to chalk up 2 days in a row of sobriety. By the time I met Jay, he'd racked up more than 5,000 of those days without a drink, while also helping hundreds of others find their sobriety. To me, that's a hero's journey, equal to anything Adius turned in. I particularly resonated with Jay's description of the lightness he felt because it was so similar to what had happened to me. The moment I let go of trying to control all the things nobody can control, I actually felt 2 forms of lightness come over me. My own inner world lit up, as if I were emerging from the shadows of my own negative thinking. I also felt the kind of lightness Jay mentioned, the sense of shedding a heavy load I'd been carrying for a long time. When I first began to uncover the tools I'm sharing with you in this book, I was 24 years old and weighed 300 pounds rather than this morning's 185. I couldn't go more than 20 minutes without a cigarette. I hated my job, and I felt trapped in an awful relationship. Within a year or so after the discovery, I dropped my addictions, shed more than 100 pounds, got out of the toxic relationship, and embarked on a new career. To say it changed my life would be an understatement. It gave me my life. I'm convinced that if I had continued the way I was going, I would have replayed my father's brief existence. He died at age 32, grossly obese, a heavy smoker, and stuck in a job he didn't like. I feel sad to this day that he never got to live out his full lifespan, and I never got to know him. I also feel incredibly grateful that I woke up in time to change the direction of my life. Sometimes I feel regret that it took me so long to figure out something so simple, but most days I feel grateful that I figured it out at all. Whether you are 24 or 44 or 84, when you are reading or hearing this, take comfort from knowing that it is never too late to release your old programming. Like every one of us, you just have to start wherever you are. Agreed. 2 kinds of thoughts. If you train your awareness on the contents of your thought stream for a while, you will discover something that may surprise you. I know it surprised me when I first caught sight of it. Your mind only thinks 2 kinds of thoughts. Thoughts about things you can control and thoughts about things you cannot control. The majority of the thoughts that pass through your mind are about things you cannot control. Dwelling on thoughts about things you can't control causes a massive amount of pain and suffering in the world. The ability to think is a precious human resource, but many of us squander that gift by thinking about things that make us miserable and that we cannot change. Meanwhile, we often overlook or fail to do the simple things we could change on the spot. There's a time and a place for thinking about things you have no control over, such as when you're using the power of your imagination to create or design something new. That's a conscious use of thinking about things you have no control over. The problem begins when your unconscious mind gets hold of the thinking machinery and starts cranking out thoughts that make you unhappy. Letting our minds continue to produce thoughts that make us unhappy is letting the tail wag the dog. If allowed to continue in that direction, our minds eventually become all tail and no dog, wagging on into eternity with no conscious purpose, making us miserable all the way. The problem of incompletion. One of the most popular ways we create unconscious mayhem in our lives is through leaving situations and communications incomplete. When I first started noticing this in my life, I was surprised to discover how often I walked away from conversations without completing them, leaving unsaid what was really on my mind or in my heart. As I expanded my awareness of incompletion, I realized that it wasn't just conversations I left incomplete. I started making a list of various incompletions, stretching back into childhood. People I hadn't thanked for their kindness to me, a former employer I'd borrowed $160 from and hadn't paid back, abuses I hadn't confronted, and many more. My list ultimately ran to 12 pages, single-spaced. I was a virtual master of incompletion. Incompletion works like the snooze alarm feature on an alarm clock. When the alarm buzzes, the sleepy person gropes for the clock and punches the snooze button, making the alarm stop buzzing. A few moments later, the noisome buzz drones into your awareness again. In college, I had to put my alarm clock on the other side of the room to keep me from irresponsible use of the snooze alarm. Otherwise, I'd keep reaching over and hitting it until noon. Here's how incompletion causes trouble for us in real life. I had a rude wake-up moment early in my career as a professor at the University of Colorado. My counseling department locked horns repeatedly with the dean, who didn't like some of the non-traditional things we did in our own program. For example, we always took the new students on a weekend camping retreat at the beginning of the academic year. Although I'm not an enthusiastic camper, full transparency, I hate camping. I always participated because the retreat had a valuable bonding effect on the students. The dean hated this sort of unorthodox learning, but he couldn't stop us because the counseling program was by far the most popular one in the entire graduate school. Anytime he threatened us, we would respond with an equally dire threat to admit fewer students. Since the budget and his overinflated salary, 3 times what the other professors and I made, were dependent on the large number of students in the counseling program, he would huff and puff for a few days, then quiet down. One day I was driving home after a meeting where the dean had been on one of his rants. I had left the meeting steamed up and found myself ferociously replaying the conversation over and over, each time inventing new and more devastating responses that proved how right I was and how wrong he was. At a stoplight, I was so caught up in a mental argument that I failed to notice that the light had turned green. The motorists behind me began to serenade me with a chorus of their horns. The blaring noise startled me out of my trance, and I accelerated jerkingly, stalling my engine. Another round of horns honking blatted behind me before I recovered and got underway. A half-mile down the road, though, the mental argument with the dean returned at full force. There I was again, back in the dean's office, in my mind, firing off all the devastatingly cutting remarks I hadn't said in the actual meeting. I found myself wondering, where had the argument gone during my episode at the traffic light? And why had it come back? 2 insights came in rapid order. First, I realized I was trying to control and change the past, which was not controllable by me or anybody else. I also realized that the argument in my mind had begun and returned for the same reason: incompletion. Much of our negative thinking comes from leaving situations incomplete. There's an old scientific saying that nature abhors a vacuum. An incompletion is a kind of vacuum, and from personal experience, I can testify that nature doesn't like it very much either. When we leave a situation incomplete, nature will find a way to keep reminding us of the incompletion. Nature seeks completion and will propel us to great lengths to get it. For example, my situation with the dean is similar to something almost everyone experiences at some time or another. I left the conversation without being fully transparent about my real feelings. I left with feelings in my body that my mouth hadn't spoken. Leaving a conversation without saying what we really need to say probably happens more often than its opposite. When we leave a conversation without fully revealing what's on our minds and in our hearts, a pressure begins to build inside of us. The force of nature then propels us to seek completion. I remember seeing a film of Yellowstone National Park's Old Faithful when I was in elementary school, marveling at how its eruptions went off predictably every hour or so. The pressure would build for an hour, then it would start sending up many belches of steam and water, early warning signs of the eruption to come. Then boom, the water would explode 100 feet up into the air. In one respect, human beings are like Old Faithful, but in another, we are strictly Old Unfaithful. We are predictable in the sense that pressure builds up in us, propelling us towards completion. Unlike Old Faithful, though, with humans, you never quite know when the eruption is going to occur. Here's a particularly vivid example of the unpredictability of completion. A client of mine, a successful entrepreneur in his late 40s, told me that he was having a pleasant after-dinner conversation over a glass of wine with his wife one evening when a sudden urge to confess came over him. We'll never know if it was a sudden urge of character strength or the effects of the second glass of wine, but in the midst of the conversation, he blurted out a truth that had been building up inside him for a year. He said, "I've been having an affair with your best friend." He told me that he started to confess the affair on several other occasions, but had not been able to get the words out of his mouth. Finally, he could no longer contain the truth, and it broke through the night. Nature is always seeking completion. A stream completes itself by joining the river. The river yearns for completion in the ocean. Completion is a powerful force. Over time, water's desire for completion can carve out a Grand Canyon. When we resist its powers, we create all the manner of unhappiness for ourselves. For a deep dive into this subject in your own life, please take the completions checklist in Appendix B. Completions in relationships. Katie and I met in 1980 and have been together ever since. I'm very grateful I didn't meet her until I was in my 30s, because during my teens and 20s, I made just about every relationship mistake possible. I still wince at some of those memories, such as having a secret affair or the teenage humiliation of begging my first love not to dump me. It took me a long time to realize that many of my incompletions reached far back into childhood. In other words, I discovered that conflicts in my present day relationships were replays of childhood dramas. For example, several years before I met Katie, I was in an on again, off again relationship with a woman I'll call Nora. We really cared for each other, but we also really hated some things about each other. For example, she was perpetually trying to quit smoking cigarettes. I had gone through the unpleasant experience of kicking cigarettes cold turkey several years before I met her. And like many former addicts, I had been militantly judgmental on the subject. When Nora would fall off the wagon and greet me with cigarette breath, I would freak out or storm out or lash out with verbal criticism. At the time, my mother was dying of emphysema caused by 50 years of heavy smoking. Every whiff of Nora's Marlboro breath triggered anger and sadness about the way my mother's addiction had consumed so much of her life. Nora's freak out pattern involved my travel. My first book came out just after we met and became a surprise bestseller in the field of education. It led to speaking engagements and invitations to present seminars all over the country. At the time, I was an assistant professor at the University of Colorado, earning $13,000 a year. Within a few months after the book's publication, I found myself often making more in a month than I did all year in my academic job. I was still carrying a burdensome chunk of student loan debt from my Stanford years, so I was very appreciative of this unexpected good turn in my fortunes. My newfound abundance and fame were great for me. I was flying all over the country, having the time of my life. Nora, not so much. Her father was a traveling salesman whose travels often involved cheating on Nora's mother. Because he was on the road 2 weeks out of every month, her father's affairs were a constant source of uproar in the family. Finally, after years of apologies and promises to do better, he gave Nora's mother a beating and never came back. It was a perfect setup for conflict between Nora and me. Two interlocking patterns that reached back into the most painful corners of our childhoods. We were each using our relationship to complete issues that were decades old. The real problem, though, was that neither of us had the slightest clue that we were being run by those ancient patterns. We just mindlessly repeated the same argument month after month. The more Nora criticized me for being away so much, the more I wanted to get away. The more I criticized her for smoking, the more often she came back reeking of cigarettes. One weekend, at a speaking conference, I had a steamy backstage kiss with a lovely woman who was also presenting a seminar at the conference. That evening, after we finished up our teaching chores, we indulged in even steamier activities that didn't end until room service breakfast the next morning. We parted with a friendly hug, knowing it was unlikely that we would ever connect again in that particular way. It was an altogether delightful interlude, except for one problem. It left me with a big incompletion. The month before, in one of my attempts to quiet Nora's traveling salesman fears, I assured her that I would not engage in any romantic activities while I was on the road. I hadn't liked making the agreement with her. Something in me knew it wouldn't solve the problem. I did it anyway, and now I was carrying the burden of a secret and a broken promise. The incompletion set up a rattle that finally ended the relationship. I hung on to the secret for a week, then a month. During that time, I noticed that my mind was jammed with thoughts devoted to explaining and justifying my behavior. For example, I'd catch myself saying in my mind, I don't need to tell Nora about this because she probably keeps a lot of secrets from me. And I don't need to tell Nora because it would be too upsetting for her. I also noticed a sharp escalation in the number of critical thoughts about Nora. Does any of this sound familiar to you? Before I tell you more of the story, take a moment to explore explaining and justifying in an experiential fashion. Hands-on activity. Pause to reflect on this question from your own experience. Is your negative thinking flavored with explaining and justifying? In other words, do you find yourself explaining things to people in your mind and justifying why you did or didn't do certain things? If so, notice this particular flavor of negative thinking and acknowledge it consciously by writing the following commitment out in longhand. I commit to learning how I make myself unhappy by explaining and justifying. As always, when you are doing a hands-on activity in this book, notice your breathing and body sensations as you make the commitment. Notice if making the commitment stirs up fear, sadness, or other emotions. The goal of this activity is to focus your attention on the relationship between unhappiness and the mental activities of explaining and justifying. The goal is to not get rid of the explaining and justifying because they both have their healthy positive uses. For example, if you are called on in math class to explain the quadratic equation, use every bit of your skill of explanation. The same goes for justifying. If your boss asks you to justify your budget request for the year, use all your skills of justification to make your points. There's a downside, however, to mental skills such as explaining and justifying. They get us in trouble when we use them in ways that perpetuate unhappiness in our lives. That's why I want you to put a bright spotlight on the explaining and justifying that goes on in your mind. You will probably notice, as I did, that most of the time I was explaining or justifying something in my mind, I was also feeling unhappy. It took me quite a while to figure out the relationship between the two. I discovered that every time I found myself explaining and justifying something, I could trace that something back to incompletion. For example, I could have called Nora the morning after my wayward tryst and said, "Nora, I broke my agreement not to have romantic adventures on my travels." If she were interested in the details, as I suspect she would have been, I could have given them to her. But I didn't do any of that. Instead, I stewed on the incompletion as a month turned into 2. Meanwhile, feeling more and more unsettled inside each day. Finally, though, the truth broke through at an odd moment. I was riding my bicycle to my office one warm day when suddenly I felt a rush of sadness and started sobbing uncontrollably. The surge of feelings seemed to come out of nowhere with an unexpected intensity. One moment I was puffing along at a rapid clip on the bike path. The next moment I was sobbing so hard that it was all I could do to wobble to a stop. It didn't take a lot of wondering to understand what the tears were about. Images of hiding the truth and lying to Nora were streaming through my mind. It felt like the cells of my body were screaming at me, "You can't keep going like this." I saw clearly what I needed to do. When my tears subsided, I jumped back on my bike and went off in search of a phone booth. Note to young readers, there was actually a time when you couldn't walk around with a phone in your hand. In those days, we phoned from our homes on a large, chunky device attached to the wall. If we were away from home and needed to make a call, we had to go in search of a public phone. These were often housed in smelly little huts along with a directory missing half its pages and a lot of intriguing inscriptions scribbled in the interior walls. You also had to have a pocket full of dimes and quarters to feed the phone. I located a phone booth and used up my dimes tracking Nora down. I caught her leaving work and arranged to meet her at her apartment. I pedaled over in a throat-clutching state of anxiety all the way. As soon as I got face to face with Nora, I opened my mouth and unburdened myself. It only took me 10 seconds or so to tell her what I'd done, but Nora took at least 10 torturous minutes expressing her strong feelings on the matter. Although I winced at Nora's rigorous assault on my character, I also noticed something surprising going on in my body, an unexpected positive feeling. It was an exhilarating sense of liberation flowing through me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could take a deep breath. I was free from the bondage of concealment. As Nora's tirade wound down, I had a hopeful thought that she might thank me for my honesty and wrap me in a forgiving hug. It didn't quite work out that way. Nora pointed to the door and told me to get the hell out. I saddled up and pedaled home, contemplating the lessons life had just served up to me. Life lesson 1. When I hide the truth, I hurt. Telling the truth makes me feel better. Life lesson 2. People don't always jump for joy and thank me when I reveal the truth to them. I realized I'd been running a con on myself since childhood. The lie I'd been telling myself went like this. I hide the truth from people because they'll feel bad if I tell them. I want them to feel good, so it's okay to lie to them. If I lie to people, it's for their own good. The real reason was not so flattering. I hide the truth from people because I don't have to deal with their reactions. I don't want to deal with their anger or hurt or punishment or whatever other feelings they might have. Later that night, I wrote in my journal, I vow from here on out to reveal instead of conceal. I have no control over how people are going to react to the truth. The only thing I can control is whether or not I speak honestly. It's ultimately not my business to manage anyone else's emotions. At some point in our evolution, all of us need to answer a fundamental question. Do I prefer to have people tell me the truth, or do I want them to lie to me so my feelings don't get hurt? I've asked that question to audiences all over the world, and whether they're in Beijing or Brooklyn, they always tell me the same thing. I want to hear the unvarnished truth. I don't want anybody to lie to me to protect my feelings. When I turn the question around, though, a sudden silence often descends on the room. I ask them, do you speak the truth scrupulously to people you care about, or do you sometimes lie to them to spare their feelings? Overwhelmingly, no matter if the audience is speaking English, Spanish, or Chinese, they admit they habitually conceal the truth so as not to push the emotional buttons of others. The conclusion: we don't want to be lied to ourselves, but we assume other people want us to lie to them. I want to live a different kind of life than that. I want a life based on honest communication and generous listening. I bet that's what you want too. I also want to create a different kind of world from the one we live in today, where the falsehoods come at us so fast it's hard to keep up with all of them. That new world gets created one choice at a time. It gets created when you choose to reveal rather than conceal, when you choose to listen mindfully rather than indulge in old assumptions. Take a moment right now to stake your place in that new world. Hands-on activity. Get paper and a writing instrument. Consider this commitment. I commit to speaking honestly and listening mindfully. Listening mindfully means to listen without interrupting or criticizing what the other person is saying. Of course, making the commitment won't guarantee that you will always speak honestly and listen mindfully, but you have to start somewhere. The best place to start is with a commitment. A commitment is a stand you take. It's a declaration. If you would like to take such a stand, write the following sentence out 3 times. I commit to speaking honestly and listening mindfully. As always, when you do the hands-on activity, notice your breathing and other body signals that occur while you're writing out the commitment. Relationships are the ultimate test. Honesty with ourselves is essential, but it is in the area of relationships where our commitment to honest speaking and mindful listening gets tested most rigorously. In my own case, committing to honesty not only made my public speaking life very simple, but it also revolutionized my personal life. I'm convinced that it led me on a direct line to a moment of destiny in 1980 when I showed up to give a talk and seminar in Menlo Park, California. And the audience that day was a professional in her early 30s named Kathleen, who would eventually be known to millions by her nickname of Katie. We've described our amazing first meeting in detail in other books, but briefly, the key part of the conversation was something like this. Me. I'm very attracted to you. I'd like to ask you out for coffee, but first I need to let you know that I have only recently figured out what I really want. I'm only interested in relationships where both people tell the truth, take responsibility for what's going on with them instead of blaming, and are passionately committed to their creative development. On other terms, would you like to have coffee with me? There was a 10-second pause while she contemplated this unusual pickup line. Then, Katie, how about lunch? By the time I met Katie, I had grown militant about what I wanted in a relationship. The 3 wants I presented to Katie, honesty, responsibility, and creative commitment, all had come from doing the exact opposite in other relationships. Essentially, they represented the most painful learning experiences of my life. Sometimes I created misery in my love life by lying or failing to notice that the other person was lying to me. Other times I made myself miserable by blaming the other person rather than owning responsibility for whatever was going on. The third misery-making pattern of mine was to get into relationships with people who were not as passionately committed to their own creative path as I was to mine. Writing is my creative path. In its pursuit, I disappear into a room by myself for several hours, almost every day. Somehow, I managed to attract several women in a row who criticized me for my daily disappearances. I tried to deal with the issue by arranging my creative hours around their schedules, but it never seems to alter the patterns of criticism. Then, one day, truth penetrated the fog. I realized I was the actual source of the criticism, not them. I took responsibility for the pattern rather than blaming anyone else. I asked myself the question, what is it in me that keeps attracting the same experience over and over with different women? I saw immediately how I'd been gestated and born into criticism, as I've written in The Big Leap and elsewhere. My appearance in the world came at a most inconvenient time for several parties. Then I was reared by my mother and grandmother, both of whom were remarkably creative women who never got to fulfill their potentials. They both felt oppressed by having to spend all their time taking care of other people, and they voiced those frustrations in more or less noisy ways on a regular basis. Now, here I was doing my own version of the same thing. It was enlightening, but also horrifying to see how unconsciously I was living out a family tradition of thwarted creativity. I added another life lesson to my growing stack. We always attract unconsciously the very things we complain about. Summarizing, I want you to take away several big learnings from this chapter. First, I want you to become aware of how much unhappiness you create through entertaining negative thoughts about four main things: the past, the future, other people, and yourself. Second, I want you to know that you cannot rid yourself of negative thoughts by aiming more negative thoughts at them. You can only retire your negative thoughts by acknowledging that you have no control over them. The moment you quit fighting your thoughts, they will quit bothering you. Finally, I want you to understand in your mind and body how the act of accepting and loving your negative thoughts just as they are dissolves and disappears them. This open-hearted act, acknowledging your negative thoughts with acceptance rather than censure, releases your attachment to them. Your acceptance, an act of generosity on your part, opens up a new world of possibility in which your generosity can be richly rewarded. Hands-on activity. I'd like you to finish this section with an activity that will help you lock in the key learnings from this chapter. Instructions. Get paper and a writing instrument. In your own handwriting, write out each of the following statements, paying attention to your breathing as you do so. I formally declare that I cannot control my negative thoughts, and I commit to letting go of trying to control them. I commit to letting go of trying to change the past. I commit to letting go of worrying about the future. I commit to letting go of trying to control other people. I commit to channeling my precious energy into positive actions I can take now. There are two spectacular payoffs for clearing negative thoughts out of your mind. First, your inner world becomes much more serene as the unpleasant chatter of negative thinking fades out of your experience. Second, this open space invites a new and deeper relationship with your own source of true creativity. How to maximize this relationship is the subject of our next exploration. That was chapter 3. We'll be back for chapter 4.